Hello and welcome to our weekly edition of Tuesday Temple Takeaway. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. And here we are a week after Easter, and this morning I want to talk about an incident that John refers to in his Gospels, and it's a week after Easter, and it relates to Thomas. The incident with Thomas and Jesus. Now, I'm sure there are times in your Christian life where you've had to miss a church service. You maybe had to miss a Sunday because of maybe illness or holidays or work commitments or family matters. And maybe later that day or on the Monday, you meet up with somebody who was actually present in the meeting, and they have an uncanny knack of making you feel that you've missed the greatest meeting on earth. And they talk up the preaching and the sense of the presence of God and maybe the prophetic and various other things, and you begin to feel, what have I missed? Oh, I wish I'd been there. I'm filled with regret because you had missed this service that this other person was talking in an upbeat way about. Well, you can imagine Thomas, can't you? How he must have felt having missed the meeting on Easter Sunday evening with the other disciples. They had gathered together and they were in behind locked doors and they were sharing the events of the day. There was rumours that were rife throughout Jerusalem that Jesus was alive, and they'd had first-hand reports, and so they're sharing the events of this momentous day, and all of a sudden Jesus appears in their midst. It's the very same Jesus, and of course he's now in a resurrection body, so he has no need to knock the door. He just appears in their midst, and the Bible says that when the disciples saw him, they were glad. That appears to be a bit of an understatement. When the disciples saw him, they were glad. And of course, they were reconnected with Jesus, and John records it for us, where he says that Jesus pronounced peace on them, and then he breathed on them, and they received the Holy Spirit. So their leader is back. The Master has returned from the dead and is back with them. But Thomas was absent. Thomas was not present with them on that first Easter Sunday. Now, he may have not got the text or the email of invitation. Something had gone astray, perhaps, but clearly he was an absentee, and he was not with them. And we don't know why. He could have been grieving. He could have been still feeling overwhelmed by the events of Good Friday and the whole tragedy for him of the cross. But clearly he didn't join up with the rest of his colleagues. And when they meet up with him, and they have great news to share, they're overflowing with joy, obviously, they were taken back, I think, by the reaction of Thomas. Because instead of sharing their joy and their delight, it's met by his demand. He said, I want to see for myself. Unless I see the nail prints for myself, I will not believe. And I'm sure the disciples were somewhat taken back by that. But that's the demand that Thomas made, of course, because you can feel for him in a way, because like the other disciples, it had been a bit of a roller coaster emotionally for all of them in the run-up to the cross, in those final days in the life of Christ. It had been very stressful, and maybe he's still trying to come to terms with all that he had seen and all that he had witnessed. And now to be told Jesus is alive, he has come back from the grave, and he's trying to process it all. He doesn't want another false dawn. He doesn't want a fake news story again, only to be let down by it. And so he lays down his own demand, and he says, I want tangible evidence. I want to see for myself. What you're saying is remarkable if it's true, but I need to see it for myself. And so he goes for a whole week in this feeling, with these feelings of uncertainty and confusion. Now, I don't know what your last week was like after Easter, and but I guess that for most of us we would have had maybe an Easter song or two still ringing around in our minds, and a song that we maybe have sang Easter Sunday, or a traditional Easter song, and we would be singing it to ourselves. We would be perhaps thinking about the sermon on Easter Sunday morning, or maybe we'd read in our daily reading something about the resurrection, and that would have been percolating again in our minds, and all good positive thoughts. But what about Thomas? I'm sure he would have woke in the middle of the night during that week thinking, is it true? Is it possible? Are my colleagues telling me the truth? Was it an hallucination, or was it really Jesus in that room with them? And so he'd have had all these kind of questions in his mind, and he would have rehearsed, of course, and reviewed some of the things that Jesus had said during his time of public ministry with them. When Jesus stood at the grave of Lazarus and said, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus standing in the temple after cleansing the temple, his father's house, and making that amazing statement by saying, destroy this temple. Of course, he wasn't speaking of bricks and mortar. He was speaking of his own body. Destroy this temple and I will raise it up again in 3 days. Just as Jonah, he says, was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so too will the Son of Man. And so all these things would have come flooding back to him, and he's processing them all because, he doesn't want to be disappointed again. He wants this to be true, but he needs to see it for himself. He's often called Doubting Thomas, of course, which I think sometimes is a little bit unkind, because he's not the only disciple to have doubted. The Gospels tell us that there were those that were doubted. Jesus had to, even after the resurrection, Jesus had to rebuke some of them for their unbelief. And, we're very quick to judge people, aren't we, and stick labels on people because of one mistake or one act, and it becomes the epitaph of their life, if you like. Yes, Thomas did make a demand that he wanted to see Jesus for himself, but I think sometimes it's a little bit unfair to call him a doubter, because there are other instances in the Gospels, John's Gospel. There are 2 references to Thomas. One is in chapter 11 and one is in chapter 14. And the one in chapter 11, Thomas is showing loyalty. He's not doubting, he's showing loyalty to Jesus, because if Jesus is going to die, he says, I want to die with him. And in chapter 14, of course, he's the one that's asking the Lord about how are we to know the way after you've left. And so it might be a little bit unfair to dub him as a doubter, and when he's involved in when we see him in other parts of the gospel where he seems to be loyal. And so 8 days later, the disciples meet up again, and Thomas is present. He still feels part of the group, and that's encouraging, that even though he perhaps was on a different wavelength to the others, he still wanted to be with them. He still wanted to connect with the group. And very often people miss out because they opt out. People sometimes get hurt or offended with church, and what do? They opt out. They don't work it through. Maybe they have a crisis of faith and they opt out, rather than trying to stay in the community of believers and work things through and come out the other end. And very often, we miss out because we opt out. But Thomas, he had a wonderful sense of belonging. He belonged to this band. And of course, he's with them in the upper room, and Jesus appears. And, the restoration of one was hugely important to Jesus. He was ever the good shepherd. He always went after the one. And Thomas was important to him. We don't read that Jesus sought out an audience with Pilate. to tell him how wrong he was, or Caiaphas to remind him that he'd made a big mistake. But he seeks out an audience with the likes of Peter and with Thomas. And because Thomas stayed with the group, he stayed in, he remained in, then he gets this encounter with Jesus. And of course, there's no condemnation from Jesus. There's no chastising of Thomas. Jesus is very gentle with him. And Jesus begins to speak to him about the very things that Thomas had told the disciples about privately. I don't think the disciples would have gone and told Jesus verbatim what Thomas had said. But of course, Jesus is the all-knowing one. And so he knew what Thomas would have said. He knew what Thomas would be thinking. And so the very words that Thomas said in private to the disciples, Jesus brings them into the public arena and brings them before Thomas. I can go back even quite a while in the Apostolic Church, and even as a boy I remember some prophetic ministry that we used to have on a Sunday, and very often the prophet would bring out conversations that people had had in the week. How staggering is that? That the prophet would refer to conversations that people had had in the homes, and some of them were a bit derogatory about the servants of God, and it would be a kind of rebuke. Here Jesus brings the words of Thomas that he'd said privately. This is my demand. And Jesus brings them to him because he is the omniscient one. He is the all-knowing one. There standing before Thomas is the very same Jesus. The same Jesus that he had walked with for 3.5 years. The same Jesus that was taken by the soldiers and put on a cross. This was the very same Jesus. Jesus invites him to extend his finger and place it into the hole in his hand. And I don't think for 1 minute Thomas did that, because a glimpse was enough. The glimpse of those wounds, that's what he wanted to see. The wounds of Jesus. How special were they? You see, the only thing that Jesus took back to heaven with him that he didn't bring with him were the wounds and the marks of the nails. And of course, they won't erase with time. They'll be there for all eternity. So when you and I get to heaven, we will see the Lamb that has been slain. We will see the wounds of Calvary. We will see the price that Jesus paid for our redemption. Thomas's response was, "My Lord and my God." Startling, isn't it? The strong affirmation of deity comes from one who we call a doubter. My Lord and my God. And then Jesus goes on to talk about us. Because he says to Thomas, because you have seen, you have believed. But there are those who have not seen and yet believed. And that's us today. People who have exercised faith in God without seeing him. But whom having not seen, we love. And so great will be the blessing for us. Great will be the reward for us that we have believed without seeing. And tradition tells us that Thomas goes on to, after this event, later in his life, he travels to India, and in AD 52, and he sets up some churches, and he shares the gospel with lots of people in India, and because this revelation had changed him again. And I pray that God will give us a revelation again of the cross. If we're going to win people for Jesus, it'd be good for us to be reminded of the wounds of Jesus and the sacrifice of Jesus, and for us to be moved again, and for us to be energized by the fact that it's the death of Jesus that saves us. It's the death of Jesus that brings us nigh to God. So thank you today for tuning in. This is the end of our series on Easter encounters, and next week we will start a new series on a fresh topic. So the Lord bless you and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.